Are you looking for a good memoir? I love this genre because these books are often entertaining and honest, and also a little bit informing. You can see what it's really like and get an insight into the mindset or life story of usually a public figure or a writer or some other creative who's inaccessible. There are lots of different types of memoirs to pick from, but first it's helpful to understand the difference between a memoir and an autobiography. So usually someone writes an autobiography in the latter period or at the end of their life. It's kind of like a chronology or a narrative of everything they did. On the other hand, a memoir is usually written by an author or writer when they're younger. It's often about a single topic or a moment or a theme rather than a chronology of events. That said, I hope you enjoy the content in this video. If you do, hit thumbs up, and to get more videos like this or about books, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. First up is Anne Frank, 1929 to 1945. She was born in Frankfurt in Germany, and when the Nazi party came to power, she moved with her family to Amsterdam. While she was hiding from the Nazis during World War II, she wrote a famous diary about the war, her thoughts, feelings and experiences. Unfortunately, the Anne Frank family were eventually discovered, and along with her sister, she was transported to Auschwitz. She was ultimately moved to Bergen-Belsen, where she passed away just 14 days before the camp was liberated. It's a terribly sad story because she was just 15 years old. Her mother and her sister were also victims of the concentration camp, but her father, Otto Frank, survived the war and published her diary. He died in 1980 when he was 91 years of age. Now, since World War II, Anne Frank has become a powerful testimony to the atrocities of the Holocaust, but her work is also a powerful reminder of the human capacity for hope and resilience in the face of great adversity. And her diary has been adapted into a play and a movie, with the former even winning a Pulitzer Prize. It's a fantastic read, and it's a fantastic entry point into this genre. Next up is an Irish memoirist, Frank McCourt, 1930 to 2009. He was an Irish-American writer and teacher. He was born in Brooklyn in New York City in 1930, the oldest child of an Irish Catholic family, and he had 4 young siblings. His family then moved back to Ireland in 1934 to escape the Depression or Recession devastating New York. But his family couldn't find work in Limerick, and his father suffered from alcoholism. So in his memoir, which is called Angela's Ashes, Frank McCourt writes about his difficult childhood growing up in Limerick. It's a powerful read, and it describes his impoverished childhood. It's got some vivid attention to detail and unforgettable stories, and it helped him win a Pulitzer Prize. Now, as great as this book is, many people in Ireland, including McCourt's mother, did acknowledge that he embellished some details. Still, that's something a lot of memoirs do when they want to tell a captivating tale for readers. Definitely one to check out. Third entry on this list is from Joan Didion, 1934. Sadly, she passed away in 2021. She's one of my favourite writers. She is, of course, an American. She started her writing career in the 1950s after winning an essay contest for Vogue magazine. During the 60s and 70s, she became one of the most celebrated young writers in American history. She, of course, wrote about the counterculture movement that rocked the 1960s and the Hollywood lifestyle. Her famous writings include the collection of essays in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which focused on the social rhetoric, the lack of morals, and the day's politics. In 1991, she again rose to literary stardom when she wrote an article suggesting the Central Park Five were innocent. And then in 2005, she won a National Book Award for her memoir about grief and the sudden death of her husband. That's called The Year of Magical Thinking, and it's a heartbreaking read. She wrote a second memoir about the unexpected death of her daughter several months later, and that's called Blue Lights. And of course, many of Didion's books and non-fiction and essays have been turned into plays, movies and documentaries. That's because Didion and her husband also worked as screenwriters. She was even the focus of an excellent documentary on Netflix, which I recommend you check out. And that's called The Centre Will Not Hold, which is taken after a theme in one of her essays. Next up is Mary Karr, who was born in 1955. She's an American essay writer and poet from East Texas. And she's also a professor of English literature at Syracuse University. Now, Mary was always interested in writing from an early age, but she had a rather difficult childhood. Both of her parents were alcoholics, and her mother suffered from a lot of mental health issues. It was only after Mary's divorce and with a prompt from her friend that she decided to write about her difficult childhood. That book became the 1995 New York Times bestseller, The Liar's Club, And Mary followed it up with 2 additional memoirs about her father, his death, and also her early life. Her work is so popular with writers, I guess she's a writer's writer, that she's even written a book that explains how you can write a memoir. Now, whatever you decide to get from Mary, I recommend picking up the audiobooks. That's because Mary Karr narrates a lot of her own work, so they're pretty engaging listens. Maya Angelou, 1928 to 2014. So she's a great example of somebody who knew or how to write powerful memoir. Of course, she was a lot more than a memoirist. She was also a civil rights activist and a poet. And she wrote lots of different poetry books, plays, essays, and even an autobiography about her life. She had a rather challenging life. She worked as a sex worker, a fry cook, and was a cast member of Porgy and Bess. Now, there are lots of books that you should check out from Maya, but perhaps the best one and the most famous one is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. It was published back in 1969, and it tells the story of her life from birth until she was aged 17. And this was her breakthrough book that helped her achieve literary stardom and critical acclaim. Later in her career, she played a role developing movies and television shows and received countless awards and dozens of honorary degrees. If you're going to read any memoirist on this list, definitely somebody to check out. Next up is another famous American writer, one of my favourites, Ernest Hemingway, 1899 to 1961. So he was a novelist, short story writer and journalist from the early 20th century. He fought in the Spanish Civil War, served on the Italian front during World War I, and reported on the landings at Normandy in World War II in 1944. He published dozens of short stories, and many of his novels are based on his experiences in the war. Some of his most famous bestsellers include The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and my favourite, The Old Man and the Sea. If you're looking for his memoir, that's called A Movable Feast, and it's also about his time in Paris and his marriage and relationships. Now, he had a rather unhappy life. Although he owned several houses in Cuba and Key West and lived on the plains, he was in a bad plane crash in 1954 and he developed chronic pain, and he ultimately died by suicide in 1961. That said, he's one of the greatest writers of all time, thanks to his sparse yet remarkably deep prose, and the same of course applies to his non-fiction. David Sedares was born in 1956. He's from America, but he's based in the United Kingdom. Now, he's a non-fiction writer, a humorist, a comedian, and arguably a public speaker too. He's best known for his witty, self-deprecating essays, which he often performs in public. You can hear him on the BBC and on This American Life. He's turned a lot of his essays into books. These include Me Talk Pretty One Day, Dress Your Family in Corduroy and Denim, and Let's Explore Diabetes with Owls. And his 2022 title is called Happy Go Lucky. Now, I'm a big fan of David Sedares. I actually took a writing course from David Sedares on Masterclass. I review Masterclass elsewhere on the channel, so go check out that video. But basically, he describes how every morning he gets up and he writes several hundred words about what he did yesterday. And he writes these sections up as short stories or as a section from perhaps a fiction book or a novel. In other words, as character descriptions, dialogue, turning points, and even a plot. And then he'll read through all of these entries and then ultimately turn what he's gathered into an essay, and then he'll perform the essay and see how people react to it, and then he'll rework the essay before ultimately turning it into a published work. So I do recommend checking out that masterclass if you want to learn about his writing process. But if you just want to read his non-fiction works, then just pick up any of the books that I mentioned a few moments ago. James Baldwin, 1947 to 1985. So he was an American novelist, playwright, and civil rights activist. He was born in New York City, and he grew up in poverty and experienced brutal racial discrimination and poverty. Despite all of these adversities, he became a prominent voice in the civil rights movement, and he used his powerful writing to address issues of race, sexuality, and social justice. Now, he's best known for his novels and also for his personal writings and essays that explore identity, race, and society. His most famous works include Go Tell It on a Mountain, Notes of a Native Son, Giovanni's Room, and The Fire Next Time. And that first book, Go Tell It on a Mountain, is semi-autobiographical. Although arguably, most fiction writers do mine from their life to write their novels too. He's considered one of the most important and influential African-American writers of the 20th century. Definitely somebody to check out. Patti Smith was born in 1946. She's an American singer, songwriter, poet, and visual artist. But her fans know her best as the godmother of punk. I was even lucky enough to see her perform a few years ago. Now, she was born in Chicago, and then she moved to New York during the late 1960s. and she became hugely involved in the city's vibrant and avant-garde music and art scene. Her music combines elements of punk, folk, rock and poetry, and she's a really distinctive, raw voice. She became a cultural icon after her 1975 debut album Horses, which is considered a punk and alternative rock classic. But you're probably here to learn about her memoir. That's called Just Kids. It's basically a book all about her early life in New York and her relationship with the celebrated photographer Robert Mapplethorpe. If you're going to get this book, don't get the print book or the Kindle book, they're fine, but actually get the audiobook because she narrates that herself and you get to hear a really distinctive voice. Definitely something to pick up if you're interested in the creative process too, because she talks about how she writes and finds inspiration. Finally, I have two recommendations from political figures. So arguably these aren't memoirists, but they're still both great writers. I'm talking about Becoming by Michelle Obama and A Promised Land by Barack Obama. This was my personal favourite between the two books, but both are good. In this book, I really like the first half where he describes his calling to become a politician and campaigning for president for the first time. I found the second half of this book was a little bit more political and I didn't agree with everything in it. But I will be getting the follow-on when he decides to write and publish it. Both are worth checking out even if you're not too interested in politics because they are fantastic writers. Those are just some of the best memoirists that you can pick from. There are many more that I couldn't include in a video like this because we could be here all day. But if you feel like there's a glaring omission, let me know in the comments section below. And if you're interested in memoir, I have other videos in the channel where I profile what memoir is and how to write it. So go and check those out. If you like this video, hit thumbs up. And if you want to get those videos, don't forget to subscribe.